So the question of women in leadership has been in the press quite often recently. What are your thoughts on how to frame the challenge companies face?
Companies face a huge number of challenges over the coming years, I think both strategically and culturally. They have a huge raft of issues on their priority list, and this is therefore going to become very difficult to get this issue to the top. However, this is now incredibly urgent. We're obviously now in a position where, thanks to the Davis report, we are in a position where quotas will be imposed upon companies, and we will end up with the resultant positive discrimination, which is not conducive to motivating your workforce, I don't think. We're also in a position where we have 3 generations in the workplace now. This is unprecedented, and I think companies will have to ready themselves for the shift in dynamics, particularly from a cultural standpoint, that will create. Women in leadership is actually just one of those factors.
What do you think are the reasons behind the misrepresentation of women at senior levels in business?
I think there are actually 3 issues here. Firstly, we've got a pretty basic issue of style. It goes without saying that men and women actually work differently. They do their work differently. Women are much less likely to shout their contribution from the rooftops. Research has shown that they actually won't apply for promotions unless they feel they meet 100% of the criteria, whereas men are much more likely to go if they think they meet 60% of it. And women are much more likely to wait for their work to speak for itself. The other research I've seen on this is that, for instance, when men and women are entering the workforce, 57% of men will negotiate their salary, whereas only 7% of women will. So this gives us an idea of just how much the mismatch is marked in businesses. So therefore the question is, as a CEO, how am I sure I'm getting the very best talent coming through in my promotion process? Therefore I need to demand much more from the leaders in my business to be identifying the talent. They need to be working much more closely with the HR function in terms of robust succession planning. And also, am I getting the best out of my mentoring schemes? Which leads me on to the second issue, which I think is around mentoring, the style in which mentoring happens in business. Women are much more likely to be supported by their mentors, and I actually coach a number of women who struggle to cope with their mentor doing this to them, and therefore really hiding them from the dynamics, the real story that goes on within their business. Men are much more likely to be pushed and advocated by their mentors, and therefore again, as a CEO, what am I seeing when I'm looking downwards? I'm much more likely to be seeing the men who are being pushed and advocated by their mentors. Then the third issue, I think, is something around network and utilisation of network. There is a lot of research around women actually being very good at establishing and maintaining external networks to their business. Men are actually much better at utilising the internal network. And therefore, women just need to be much better at playing an internal game, if you like. Social capital is the currency in business, and women just need to get much better at using that.
Is there anything else you feel organisations can be doing to address this issue?
Yes, I think there are actually 2 factors here. Firstly, if we actually look at the way business has developed over the past 2 decades, growth has actually been relatively stable, and therefore organisations have employed a functional structure chart. Therefore recruitment, I think, has happened into those functions. Now, effective function working is all very well and good. When it works properly, it's great. When we degenerate into silo working, the interplay between the functions becomes ineffective, and actually we end up in a position where we have a little bit of trench warfare going on between the functions operating in business. So I think then, to take that on a level, there are 2 important factors here. When you look at women and their career paths and where they end up, women are much more likely to end up in support functions, marketing, human resources, risk, compliance. And therefore, the more disjointed a business is, the more ineffective the functional interplay is between the frontline businesses and their support functions. Therefore, do we really understand each other? Are we really seeing the best out of our stakeholder relationships? If I'm operating in a frontline business, am I actually thinking people in the support functions are equipped to be understanding the challenges I face? Therefore, are we getting a bit of functional bias into potential gender bias? So as a CEO, I would actually be looking at aligning my business. I must get more alignment in order to make sure I'm getting the very best from my functions. The second issue is one I alluded to earlier in terms of Generation Y, which are actually, they're age 30 and under, they're still entering the workforce. They're a huge generation in terms of numbers and attitude. They operate, they've never operated without technology, they work in a very instant world. They're quite impatient and intolerant in terms of things they see from businesses. Things like social responsibility, for instance. Yes to the environment, but also to our people. If we're not actually taking diversity seriously, then Gen Y are actually much more likely to leave businesses because they're looking for that. They're looking for organisational structures that are collaborative, that are innovative, and therefore much flatter, actually. They want to operate in flat, open structures. So I think as the leadership in an organisation, if I'm addressing these two issues, the issues of alignment and the issue of equipping my business to be dealing with Gen Y and the way that they work, then I think by definition I will be addressing the issue of women in leadership.